CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Juliet Mann.
And I'm Li Jianhua. Our top stories. A three-day truce in the desolate fighting in Sudan, which appears to be holding, is allowing foreign countries to get more citizens out.
Let's finish this job. I know we can. Because this is...
Seeking a second term at the age of 80, US President Joe Biden formally announces he will run for re-election in 2024.
And here we go again. Shares in the US regional bank First Republic plunged nearly a third after a worse-than-expected drop in deposits. Will it be the third bank to collapse this year?
And malaria fix. It's a global killer that claims over 600,000 lives a year. But could a newly approved vaccine be a game changer?
And the fighting in Sudan has eased after the army and paramilitary forces agreed to a three-day truce, allowing more Sudanese to flee and foreign countries to evacuate more citizens.
The UK is the latest country to airlift its nationals out of the capital, Khartoum. It comes as sporadic gunfire has been reported despite the ceasefire. The country's warring factions have been fighting for nearly 2 weeks, with more than 450 people killed and thousands injured.
And our correspondent Michael Voss has more on the evacuations of foreign nationals and the Sudanese trying to flee to safety.
The mass evacuation of foreign nationals is now in full swing as governments from around the world rush to make the most of the 72-hour ceasefire, hoping that it will hold. Plane loads of evacuees are now arriving at airports across the region, while foreign ships are docking at Port Sudan, capable of taking much larger numbers of people. Many of the foreign nationals are being evacuated from the small Wadi Saidna airbase, about 22 kilometres north of Khartoum. The difficulty is getting there through numerous checkpoints. More evacuations are taking place by ship from Port Sudan, more than 800 kilometres by road from the capital. An Indian naval vessel has docked at Port Sudan, and British warships are also heading there to help with the evacuation. Britain has come under criticism for getting its diplomats out 2 days ago, but no ordinary citizens. Even before the ceasefire, European Union countries managed to get more than 1,000 of their citizens out of the country. Now, the first British flight with civilian evacuees left Sudan Tuesday morning, with more to follow. It isn't just foreigners who are fleeing. Tens of thousands of Sudanese are leaving the capital and other areas hit by the fighting. But it's becoming increasingly expensive to find ways out.
The price of bus tickets has shot up. It used to cost around $60 to get to Egypt. Now they are charging almost $350. It's a huge increase.
Those fleeing the fighting are mainly trying to get to Egypt, Chad and South Sudan, which has also been plagued by its own civil war. There's concerns this mass exodus of people could lead to wider instability in the region. The United Nations fears that the arrival of thousands of displaced Sudanese will stretch its already limited resources in the region.
Assistance programs that were already overstretched are now severely hampered. All UNHCR operations in Sudan's neighboring countries impacted by this new emergency already have existing large refugee and IDP populations and are also severely underfunded.
For those who remain, food is scarce. Some are without water and electricity, and hospitals are near collapse. All this adding to a sense of urgency for many seeking to flee amid little hope the bloody conflict between rival military factions in Sudan is about to end anytime soon. Michael Voss, CGTN.
Well, our correspondent Patrick Oyet is following developments from South Sudan's capital, Juba. Patrick, what's the latest on foreign countries' evacuation efforts?
Yes, evacuation is still ongoing. The first phase of the evacuation, especially for the Europeans, was actually the extraction of diplomats and their families. That has been successful. Now we are seeing the European countries now removing their nationals who had remained in Sudan. For example, we are told that the British will have 2 planes this very night actually removing their nationals that had remained in Sudan. We have also seen other African countries now extracting their nationals from Sudan. For example, South Africa has just announced that it has now moved its nationals, about 77 of them, to Egypt, and they have also carried along with them some other people from other countries, including Brazil and other countries in the southern part of Africa. Kenya has announced that it is also now extracting its nationals from Sudan. So the evacuation process is ongoing, and now the focus is shifting majorly to other nationals. The first one was to extract the diplomats, and we're also seeing Sudanese are also leaving the country. So it's not just about the foreign nationals, but also Sudanese people. A number of them have crossed to Egypt. In South Sudan, a number have also crossed. The government actually said that it is more than 10,000 of Sudanese people have now crossed to South Sudan as refugees. So it is not only the foreign nationals, it is including also the Sudanese themselves who are leaving the country.
And what about the fighting? Because despite the ceasefire, there have been reports of gunfire. So what is the current situation?
Yes, there are sporadic fighting. For example, in the afternoon on Tuesday, there were, of course, reports of gunshots along or around Omdurman, which is located in the north of Khartoum. And that is really something which many people are worried about. But unfortunately, it might continue because the challenge is as both sides in the violence claim, to be controlling everywhere. If you ask the Rapid Support Forces, they'll tell you we are in control of Omdurman. If you ask the Sudan Armed Forces, they'll say we are in control of Omdurman. So normally what happens is that whenever now clashes do take place in such an area, it's difficult to verify who has violated. In other circumstances, when they are fighting, there are always something called buffer zone where, can be created. And if another group crosses to the other side, then you know who has violated. But because this fighting is taking place in the city, it's difficult to know who has violated, and the parties are taking advantage of that.
Patrick Oye in Juba, thank you very much for that update.
And Aliona Sinenko is the regional spokesperson for Africa at the International Committee of the Red Cross. Earlier, I asked her what the organization can achieve during a 3-day truce.
Well, we are hoping that the ceasefire materializes and that it brings concrete change for the people, for Sudanese civilians who have been enduring horrific suffering in over a week now. For us, we are preparing emergency response and looking at any possible ways to reach hospitals, to be able to help them restore power and water lines and bring urgent supplies.
And how safe do humanitarian workers feel at the minute?
The situation in Sudan was very unsafe for civilians, for humanitarian workers in over a week. We were forced to relocate our team from Khartoum to another location, to a safer space outside the capital, from where they continued to work because the fighting and the shelling was so relentless. We had bullets and shrapnel entering our offices. So right now we are monitoring situation very closely, ready to step in and to bring humanitarian assistance as soon as the situation will allow.
And Aliona, how much access have you had to the affected areas? And we know that it is very difficult to bring people out of the country at this point.
It has been extremely difficult, and what we were seeing more and more, that Sudanese civilians, when they run out of food, run out of water, they have to make these desperate decisions. They leave their homes and try to flee to safer places while the fighting is still ongoing. And this is why the toll of civilian casualties has been constantly rising. So these numbers are horrific when we look at hundreds of people now who lost their lives. So we hope that the ceasefire holds, that it provides a meaningful truce, because it can make a tremendous difference for civilian population, for humanitarian workers, for medical workers, to be able to care for the wounded, to collect the dead bodies, for us to be able to reach hospitals.
US President Joe Biden is officially running for re-election in 2024.
Let's finish this job. I know we can.
He made the formal announcement in a campaign video urging voters to give him 4 more years to finish what he started. It sets the stage for a potential rematch with his predecessor Donald Trump, who has already launched his bid for the White House. Well, let's speak to our correspondent Nick Harper, who's in Washington, D.C. Hi there, Nick. So, Joe Biden has officially declared. What's the main focus of his campaign?
Yeah, this one has been the worst kept secret, Juliet, in Washington for some time. It had been strongly hinted at, but this is the official announcement, a video being released just after 6 a.m. local time here. And in that video, we are seeing President Biden very much framing the fight at the moment for the United States as one that needs to be taken to the voters. He's suggesting that there is a threat of danger ahead if the Republicans were to retake the White House next year. The video starts with images of the January 6th attack on the Capitol building 2.5 years ago. It also shows pro-democracy protests, and he very much tries to frame it as a threat to not just democracy in the United States, but also personal freedom, so abortion access, for example. Within that video, he says that every generation has faced a moment when they have to defend democracy, and he says this is our moment. But his approval rating isn't particularly good. Over the last few days, there have been new polls showing his approval rating dipping by about 3% in the last month. It's down to just 39% of Americans who think he's doing a good enough job. And on top of that, there's been polls released just ahead of this announcement showing that the majority of Democratic voters do not think that he should seek a second term.
But Nick, he might have declared that he still needs to secure the nomination, doesn't he, for the Democratic Party? And he's not without his critics. So how likely is it that there'll be any challengers?
Thank you.
Well, there's already a couple of challengers in the wings. We have the nephew of the former US President John F. Kennedy. There's also a self-help guru, Marianne Williamson. Both of them are running against President Biden, but those are not considered to be serious challenges. Really, there is no heavyweight challenger waiting in the wings to take on President Biden. It has been something that's been bemoaned within the Democrat Party over the course of the last year, that essentially there is nobody else out there, a new generation of politicians who could perhaps take on the mantle from President Biden. So yes, he needs to win that nomination. That won't happen for another 12 months or so. But with no real challenger, he is likely to get that nomination. But his age is potentially a huge stumbling block. He's 80 at the moment. If he were to win a second term, he would leave the White House at the age of 86. And I think that's why we've seen in this campaign video shots of the president running, shots of the president being very energetic, really trying to show that vitality. In the last campaign, in 2020, he really didn't have to get out on the campaign trail that much because of the pandemic. He did a lot of campaigning, doing webcasts from his basement. It will be different this time around. He will be out on the campaign trail, and it will be very important to show to voters that he still has enough juice in the tank to take on this second bid for the White House.
Interesting to see if he's still got it. And also, look, within the last few hours, we've heard of the death of Harry Belafonte. Not only a huge figure in the world of entertainment, but equally known as a long-time civil rights activist.
Yeah, very much so. One who has been in lockstep with the Democratic Party and its values for many years. The fact that he was a black entertainer in the 1950s and 60s, at a time when segregation was still very much entrenched here in the United States. He was part of the civil rights movement as that headed through to the middle of the 1960s. He even, for example, paid bail money to get various activists out of jail, including Martin Luther King Jr. He pushed the civil rights movement and was very pivotal to all of that. He obviously has been, we've seen tributes being paid to him, but he will be greatly missed. The fact that he was so central for that push to try and end segregation and to try and give better civil rights to the black community here in the United States.
So I'm sure lots of tributes will be pouring in. Nick Harper in Washington, D.C., thank you very much.
Still to come on CGTN Europe, tougher rules for tech giants. We are in Brussels to hear about the new guidelines the EU is proposing for social media companies.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans, grey rhinos, and unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Shares in First Republic have plunged by nearly a third after the US bank reported a worse-than-expected drop in deposits. This is reigniting fears of a new banking crisis. For more on the biz earnings season, let's speak to our correspondent, John Terrace in New York. John, great to see you. So, First Republic was wisely anticipated.
Yes. Hey. Yes, well, this is one of the banks that we thought might be going a bit skew-whiff, you see, a bit off the rails a little bit. Right? If you remember the history of this, is that about a month ago, 10th of March, something like that, we had two big regional banks go over, SVB and Silvergate in New York. Then there was Credit Suisse being taken over by UBS with lots and lots of Swiss government money. Then there was concern about the big Wall Street banks, where I am. That seems to have sort of dissipated, at least for the time being. And then we come to First Republic. Now, First Republic is one of the regional banks here. There is a lot of affection for regional banks in America. It's a tier of banking that many other countries don't have, but we have it here. Banks dotted all over the country, and First Republic is one of them. And they have some jolly good adverts on the television. My goodness me, they really are attractive adverts. However, they've been in trouble for about the last month, apparently. They gave us their earnings last night, and they were mixed. That is to say, they beat on the top of the bottom line. They beat Wall Street expectations, so that's good. But wait till you hear this. Deposits at the bank were down $72 billion in this period. That's about 40.8%, 41%. So that is not really terribly good. And it follows Western Alliance, which was the next bank in line that we thought was in real trouble, giving us earnings last week where they said in the first quarter the deposits there were down by 11%, but in April alone they were up by about $2 billion. And Western Alliance shares were up about 24% when they closed last Wednesday. First Republic presently down by about a third. And the upsum of all this is that the banking crisis seems to be stable for the time being. But I've got to tell you, I've said this before, and I'll probably end up saying it again, many people think that there is another shoe to drop. We just don't quite know when it's going to drop or where it's going to drop. But for the time being, the issue is kind of on the back burner, whether or not there's a banking crisis here or not. Many people say it's a management crisis, a mismanagement crisis, and that there's a difference. So we'll see.
Yeah, another shoe to drop. And what else has just reported?
Well, this is the busiest week for earnings in the first quarter, and we have a real laundry list here. I'll probably take the rest of the show, if that's okay.
No problem.
Beginning with McDonald's, same-store sales up 12.6%. That's remarkable. 12.6% is extraordinary. Higher prices and a boost in traffic. That's people walking into the stores. And they've done that for 3 quarters in a row now. The CFO says some people are pushing back on their higher prices. They don't like that. And other people are putting fewer items in their basket. So we'll see how that goes. I know that they also cite China as a reason for that increase in same-store sales. Shares down 1% right now, though they're also seeking further investment in China. Yesterday, Coca-Cola told us that it was increasing its guidance for the year, and higher demand and prices were helping the company. Same story today with their great rival from New York, Pepsi. Steady demand for their drinks and their snacks. I think Pepsi has a greater range of stuff than Coca-Cola does. But their demand is still very high and their forecast is sparkling. So Pepsi shares are up 2.2% now. General Motors is ending the Chevy Bolt, which is the first ever mass market EV. They're planning to be all EV by the year 2030, 2035. But today the shares are down 2.6%. Their quarter was strong and their guidance was also lifted, but the share price is down. General Electric got a boost from its jet engine division, but their shares are down 2% at the moment. UPS is a microcosm of the U.S. economy. Shares down 9%. Shipping is lower for them, but their profits are up, but only because they're cutting costs. And this one you'll love, Spotify, the streaming service. This is great. They've got 210 million paid subscribers around the world. 500 million people use the service, but 210 million pay for it. And their shares, as a result, are up 6%. But like everybody else, even they are beginning to cut costs. So there'll be less content on Spotify going forward.
And what about the rest of the week?
I know. It's exciting, isn't it? Well, in about 4 hours' time, we're going to hear from Microsoft and from Alphabet. This is Google, of course. It'll be Google and YouTube. Now, the battle of the bots is on now. Microsoft's ChatGPT and Google's Bard, which has read every book that's ever been digitized and every page on the internet. And Google are so nervous about the Bard that they're releasing it in drips and drabs because it's doing things, and they don't know why it's doing things. It's doing them on its own. Anyway, so the battle of the ChatGPTs is coming up, and also with Google, when we give their figures later on today, will be how much the advertising is either up or down. Wednesday, Meta Platforms, Mark Zuckerberg and his metaverse. Thursday, Amazon, Intel and Snap Inc. And Friday, the oil majors, Exxon and Chevron. So all to play for here.
What a week. Thank you very much. That is our correspondent, John Terrace in New York. Thank you so much, as always.
Well, here's something that a lot of those companies John mentioned will be watching closely. The European Union is setting out tougher rules to regulate tech giants like Google, Facebook and Twitter, among others. Brussels says the aim is to keep users safe. But what will the changes mean in practical terms for the social media platforms? Well, joining us now is our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. Good to see you, Alex. So those biggest online platforms and search engines, what are they facing next?
Yeah, Julia, you're absolutely right. It will involve a lot of the companies that John was just talking about. A list of 19 platforms and search engines designated as very large online platforms by the European Commission today. They include some that you would expect, like Facebook and Instagram and Amazon, Apple, tech giants, but also online retailers like Zalando that you might be surprised to see on that list. They will all have to really face the highest level of regulation the European Union has in its arsenal. That will involve having a single compliance person, a point person that the European Union can call if they have any issues with things going on the platform. They will have to run risk assessments against things like illegal content or risks towards fundamental rights or civic discourse or electoral interference. They will have to implement mitigation procedures to mitigate against those potential online harms. These are all things that uniquely large platforms that have more than 45 million monthly active users will have to put in place. They're also going to have to give us or give users the option of having a feed or a recommendation of content that isn't based on the data they collect from us and isn't based necessarily on algorithmic decisions. transparency obligations, auditing, very detailed data sharing with regulators, and sharing data that regulators ask for. So this is really quite a huge shift in the way that these companies will be operating. They used to operate very much in their own rules, in their own space. They wouldn't be sharing their data, they wouldn't be sharing how their algorithms work, and now, because of the risk assessments, they're going to have to. And finally, there's also a bit of a break glass measure that they're going to have to respond to, which is if the European Union decides that there is an emergency, there is a very serious issue going on social media platforms. We've seen, for example, one example of that is terrorist attacks being live streamed on certain social media platforms. Well, then the European Union will be able to make an emergency intervention saying you need to step in right now, and those platforms will have to act. So a really broad change, and a lot of changes coming for these platforms.
Alex, it does sound like a lot of form filling is going to need to happen here. So practically, what changes will we all be able to see from these new rules?
Yeah, that's very fair, Juliette. We're talking about the DSA and we're talking about VLOPs because this is Brussels, and so there's a lot of acronyms and a lot of jargon. What does it actually mean for us? Well, one thing that users might see changing on platforms like Instagram or Facebook, Twitter has already implemented one of these changes, is what I mentioned about those recommendations and how we get fed content. Now, you'll still see the normal feed as you do, like on TikTok with the For You feed or the normal Instagram feed, which recommends things that it thinks you want to see based on the data it collects from the way you scroll and the way you use the platform, and an algorithm makes that decision. Now, these platforms are going to have to give us an alternative. For example, Twitter gives us the ability now to just see people we follow, not things that it thinks we'll be interested in. So that's one of the most practical things that we will feel and that we will see. We'll also have a lot more information as users. That's what the European Commission is really keen to emphasize. This is about user empowerment. Users will have a better control over their privacy, over their data, and over how that data is used by these platforms. So those are the things we'll see very practically. The reality is most of this stuff will happen in the background behind the scenes in conversations between these very large platforms and the European Commission, looking at how to mitigate against things like electoral interference, these things that are hard to measure, having more data for regulators to make these decisions and step in. So a lot of the stuff will happen behind the scenes. We might feel the effects in a few years, in a few decades, as the case may be, but certainly in the short term, our feeds will change a little bit and we'll have a lot more information and control over our data. Juliette.
Alex Cadier in Brussels, thank you very much. Well, let's get more on this now with Professor Ioannis Kokoris, antitrust expert and Professor of Law and Economics at Queen Mary University here in London. Good to see you, Professor. Let's start with the UK and the new bill empowering the regulator to oversee the position of major tech firms. What are the new rules and will they really make a difference?
Well, it's expected to make a difference. The UK has been working on it for quite some time now. The Competition Authority of the UK has already had a draft bill for at least 2-3 years now, and now finally this is going through the next step. So we expect to see a difference on two levels. We expect to see a difference first from a consumer point of view. As a consumer, as everyday consumers, we go to book a flight, we go to book a hotel, we see some reviews of the hotel. We are not always sure, is it a legitimate review, is it a fake review? So, for example, the new bill will deal with fake reviews. Another point that the new bill will deal with is, for example, subscription. You sign up for a subscription, you don't always have a clear idea how can you cancel, when can you cancel. The new bill will deal with any type of misleading or unclear cancellation terms. And then it's the bigger picture, because the new bill will also want to tackle conduct by companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, which affect us consumers at the second step. Affects first the competitors around them, possibly, and then that leads to harm to consumers. So the bill will cover both direct consumer harm and indirect consumer harm through conduct of other companies.
So very much focused on the consumer, but if you were a startup in the EU, is it any different? I mean, what should startups be looking out for or changing in the way they operate?
At this point, the bill in the UK and the equivalent one in the EU applies to companies which will most likely be beyond the startup stage. Will be when companies will actually have reached a number of users per month or a number of capitalization on an annual basis. So it's not predicted to affect a startup structure. where we can have an indirect impact, which has been debated so far, and we will see now what it turns out to be, is you had a number of startups which are actually investing in order to be, at some point later on, acquired by one of the big guys. Now, this type of acquisitions, this type of approaches will be under scrutiny. So you may have less of an incentive of a startup to invest up front to design the new best thing technology on virtual reality, for example, because any acquisition by one of the big players and cashing out can be monitored, can be assessed, and can be blocked, actually.
So tricky then. This just shakes up the whole market.
Yes.
And you know what? It's all very well having these new rules, but what if they're not kept to? I mean, will fines be substantial enough? Is enforcement going to be a challenge?
Mm-hmm. Well, enforcement will be a challenge, and will be a challenge because we are turning an agency which is not supposed to be doing regulation into an agency that has to do regulation. This is the competition agency either in the UK or the European Commission. So we're turning agencies which have not been used to do this type of analysis to regulators. So enforcement will not be straightforward. The agencies will need new staff, will need more experienced staff in these areas, and they will need to be able to act quickly, because the whole point of having these bills is to proactively prevent harm from arising to consumers. If you cannot act quickly, then you have actually lost the game. When it comes to penalties, the rules say the companies can be fined up to 10% of the global annual turnover. Now, authorities in Europe have been pretty adamant of actually enforcing strict penalties. We will see how it goes here, but we expect that these bills will have teeth. Otherwise, it will be such a waste of time and effort and an opportunity lost for consumers.
Yeah. So they'll have teeth, but there's going to be a need for speed. Professor Ioannis Kokoris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Chinese researchers say they have made a breakthrough in the 6th generation cellular network, also known as 6G. Scientists in Beijing have conducted the first real-time wireless transmission using a special antenna known as terahertz waves to achieve ultra-high-speed communication. Future 6G technology is expected to see vast improvements in data speed, imaging and wireless intelligence.
China's Commerce Minister Wang Wentao has held talks in Brussels with European Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis. They discussed trade ties and investment cooperation, maintaining stability of industrial supply chains and strengthening the multilateral trading system.
Streaming giant Netflix will spend $2.5 billion in South Korea, doubling the amount it has invested in the country since 2016. Netflix wants to create more content there, following the success productions like Squid Game. Netflix boss Ted Sarandos announced the plans following a meeting with South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, who is on a state visit to the US.
An energy-efficient house project worth $19 million has been unveiled by the University of Salford in the UK.
And it will play a role in testing the technologies to make homes greener and cheaper to run. Our correspondent Stefan McCall reports.
Are these the houses of the future? That's what researchers in Manchester are hoping to find out. They've built a giant $19 million climate chamber in search of the most energy-efficient home. 2 model houses have been kitted out with infrared panels and the UK's first roof heat pump, a space and money-saving alternative to a gas boiler. The outside of the homes are made with a special thermal material that insulates better than brick. Inside, the homes can be programmed to respond to temperature changes through the use of an app. It's time to put the buildings to the test.
It's an incredibly cold -17 degrees here at the Energy House at the University of Salford. Researchers are able to recreate a range of temperatures, including snow at the moment, and then they can take it to sun, wind and rain to test out what homes of the future will be coming up against. It allows them to recreate conditions in a matter of weeks that via traditional ways could take years.
Bills here will be around $95 a month, according to the home builders, compared with just under $400 in old terrace homes. But the big upfront cost associated with going green often puts people off.
The way to look at it for me is that, yes, the homes will be more expensive because you're adding technology to them. But actually, those costs are put into a mortgage that's done over a 20-25 year period.
Soon people will move into these model homes and their every move will be closely monitored to find out which technology and which materials are best suited to real-world living.
We can also look at climate change predictions. So a building that will be built in 2023 or 2025 when the regulations changed, how well is that going to perform in 2030, 2050 and 2080?
After the trial is complete, researchers are hoping to use what they learn from the UK project and take it internationally, to places all the way from Switzerland to Shanghai. Siobhan McCall, CGTN, Salford.
To keep in touch with the news from China and our correspondents around Europe, head over to the Telegram app on your phone and search CGTN Europe. Follow the channel to get updates sent directly to you, including pictures, features and interviews that explain the events driving the news agenda.
And coming up on CGTN Europe, described as a world changer in the fight against malaria, we speak to one of the scientists behind the vaccine that could save millions of lives.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference. What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be, CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Juliette Mann and Li Jianhua. The headlines again. Seeking a second term at the age of 80, US President Joe Biden formally announces he will run for re-election in 2024. A 3-day truce in the deadly fighting in Sudan, which appears to be holding, is allowing foreign countries to get more citizens out.
Paul Moorcraft worked extensively in the UK Ministry of Defence and is now Director of the Centre for Foreign Policy Analysis. I asked him about the impact on the wider region if the conflict in Sudan continues.
It's a very tense conflict between two men. These two generals know each other very well. Let's call them intimate enemies. They know each other very well. They hate each other very well too. And this war is going to go on till one side wins, one person wins, or the other is killed. It will expand, and it will have a big impact not only on refugees. South Sudan is in a very bad state, and yet people from Sudan are moving to South Sudan. They're going to Chad, which can't hold any more or support any more refugees. So there's going to be an extra refugee crisis in the whole region. And it was a pity because Sudan was very stable, particularly, for example, for controlling the vast amount of people who were trying to illegally enter Europe. Sudan worked to stop that. So this is going to be another Libya, perhaps even, God forbid, another Somalia. So it could, unless the international community, and I don't mean the Americans or the British, I mean the local influencers, Egypt and Saudi Arabia particularly, they're the only ones who can have a real impact.
Ukraine says it's carrying out raids on the bank of the Dnieper River to try to dislodge Russian troops. Moscow has held the eastern side near Kherson since retreating from the city in November, but Kiev is expected to launch a counteroffensive soon to recapture territory.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian missiles have hit a museum in the eastern city of Kupiansk, killing at least 2 and burying others under rubble. Russia has denied deliberately targeting civilians. Our correspondent Shelby Wilder has the latest from Kyiv.
Yes, well, the latest we have heard is that Kupiansk in the Kharkiv Oblast came under attack and that Russian missile hit a museum in that city. Reportedly, 2 people have been killed and 10 others have been wounded. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that this was just another example of Russia trying to destroy Ukrainian history, culture and its people. Now, Russian forces had captured Kupiansk last year when this conflict began. It's an important rail hub, but Ukraine managed to take that city back in September of last year.
We're hearing reports from the BBC that Ukrainian forces are carrying out raids across the Dnieper River in the southern Kherson region. Russia's denying that. I mean, what is the latest in Kherson?
Yeah, so following reports yesterday that Ukrainian troops had crossed over the Dnieper River into Russian-occupied territory in the southeast of Ukraine, today Ukrainian officials confirmed that. The deputy head of the Kherson region said that Ukrainian troops are now frequently carrying out raids on the eastern bank of the Dnipro. And what this means is that Ukrainian forces now are trying to dislodge Russian positions. Russia's military took up bases on that eastern bank last November after they retreated from the key Ukrainian city of Kherson when Ukraine recaptured it. Otherwise, Ukrainian military officials have said that these operations call for, quote, informational silence, end quote, as they are seemingly not wanting to reveal any sensitive plans about that upcoming counteroffensive. And otherwise, we have been hearing reports that because of Ukrainian forces now landing on the eastern bank of the Dnipro, Russia is now apparently forcibly removing residents from parts of the Kherson region near where Ukrainian troops have landed, again on that eastern bank. And Russia is trying to evacuate these civilians. Ukrainian officials have said that this could be in regards to anticipation of that upcoming counteroffensive.
The World Health Organization's World Malaria Day aims to raise awareness of one of the world's most deadly diseases. It infects about 250 million people per year, and it's the cause of 620,000 deaths. 95 of the cases are in Africa. And prevention continues to be the main way of avoiding being affected with malaria. Mosquito nets, repellents and anti-malaria medicines are key to the fight. Since at least the 17th century, humans have tried to treat the disease by using ground-up bark from the cinchona tree, scientists eventually extracting the key ingredients of quinine in 1820. And it wasn't until the end of the 19th century that it was the first proven that mosquitoes carried the disease. And over the next decades, a number of treatments and preventative medicines were identified, including chloroquine in 1934. In the 1980s, work began on a vaccine, a jab made by GlaxoSmithKline, was eventually endorsed by the World Health Organization in 2021. And that same year, China was declared malaria-free. But now, a new vaccine developed by Oxford University that can be produced in higher volumes has been approved by use in Ghana and Nigeria. And earlier I talked to Professor Katie Ewer from the Vaccine Immunology at Oxford University's Jenner Institute.
Well, it's a great achievement for us to be here today. It's been a very long road to having a very highly effective malaria vaccine. I've been working in malaria vaccines myself for 15 years. I've tested at least a dozen new vaccine candidates. None of them have worked until R21. So it's a massive achievement, not just for Oxford, but for everybody in the field who's been working towards this for so long.
So how difficult was it to have your vaccine approved in Ghana and Nigeria?
So we have been submitted data to the WHO and regulators for a little while now, pending approval of the vaccine for widespread use. So it's really up to independent regulators in those countries to decide if they're happy for the data. We don't really have that much involvement as scientists. You know, once it gets to that stage, we hand it over to them. But it's great news to see these vaccines being approved for the first time in Africa, where they're really needed, without waiting for WHO approval to go ahead with these vaccines.
So how long was the process, and how does the vaccine work exactly in layman's words?
So we've been developing R21 since 2015, and R21 works in the same way that all vaccines work. They train our immune system to recognise a virus, or in the case of malaria, a parasite, and to produce antibodies to fight that infection off. And what we know with malaria is that you need very high levels of antibody to get good levels of protection, much higher than we need for some other diseases, and that's why it's been so difficult to get to where we are today.
So the vaccine has been approved for use in children aged 5 and 36 months, the age group at the highest risk of death from malaria. So what does this mean for the global fight against malaria?
Well, it's huge. I mean, we already have some tools that are effective in combating malaria, so things like insecticide-treated bed nets, seasonal malaria chemoprophylaxis, where people take anti-malarial drugs before the malaria season. But we've never had a vaccine, and this will be an incredible, useful addition to the toolbox. And if we take Nigeria, for example, Nigeria is one of the countries globally worst affected by malaria. It has over a quarter of all cases of malaria every year. 60% of hospitalizations in Nigeria are related to malaria. 30% of childhood deaths in Nigeria are due to malaria. So it's a really great location to see this vaccine rolled out for the first time. And I'm really pleased that Nigeria are at the front of getting this vaccine deployed.
And with malaria and COVID vaccines now under the belt, which life-threatening diseases are you and your team working on?
Well, I mean, we've been working on making lots of different vaccines for a very long time, and I think before COVID, people were much less interested in our work than they are now, which is great. I think it's really good to see how much interest there is in vaccines now. So we've made this malaria vaccine against the most deadly form of malaria, which is called falciparum, and that's the one that's very common in sub-Saharan Africa. But there's another form of malaria called vivax malaria, which is very common in Asia. And although it doesn't cause as many deaths as falciparum malaria, it does have a massive economic and public health impact. So I think the next thing that we will be taking forward is hopefully a vaccine against vivax malaria.
A jury is being selected in the United States to hear evidence that former President Donald Trump allegedly raped a prominent American columnist in the 1990s. E. Jean Carroll has accused Trump of sexually assaulting her in a New York department store. She says he then defamed her after she went public years later. Trump denies the allegation. He's facing a series of legal challenges that threaten to derail his 2024 run for the White House.
Singapore is set to hang a 46-year-old man for trafficking cannabis into the country in 2013. The UN Human Rights Office has urged the city-state to urgently reconsider the scheduled execution. Singapore has some of the world's toughest anti-drug laws, which it says are necessary to protect society.
PCR testing will soon be dropped for passengers heading to China. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says all inbound travellers will only need to show a negative COVID antigen test taken within 48 hours before departure. The new rule will take effect at the end of the month.
The toughest race in the world's Marathon des Sables has begun in Morocco's Sahara Desert. The ultra-marathon involves 6 stages over 250 kilometers. More than 1,000 competitors are taking part. So far, 20 have dropped out after the first stage, and a dozen more were unable to start on the morning of the second stage due to extreme fatigue.
Still ahead on CGTN. Over the moon, Japan's ice-based rocket prepares for the world's first commercial lunar landing.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The cleanup operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew. And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back. Japanese startup iSpace is preparing to land on the moon in what would be the world's first commercial lunar landing. The Hakuto R lander due to touchdown shortly. It was launched on a SpaceX rocket from Florida in December, and since then it's taken a 3-month trek to end orbit around the moon. The lander is carrying a rover developed in the United Arab Emirates, the first Arab-built lunar spacecraft.
The designers of China's Mars rover say it has likely suffered excessive accumulation of sand and dust. Scientists have confirmed it hasn't woken up from a scheduled hibernation on the surface of the red planet. The solar-powered Zhurong, named after an ancient Chinese god of fire, landed in 2021, making China only the second nation after the United States to succeed in landing such a probe on Mars.
And China has unveiled its most detailed plan for deep space exploration. CGTN correspondent Swing Ye has more.
Wu Yanhua, chief designer of China's deep space exploration major project, gave a clear and detailed plan for deep space exploration Tuesday. Wu said China will launch the Queqiao-2 relay satellite and the Chang'e 6 probe in 2024 to retrieve lunar sample. It will launch Chang'e 7 around 2026 for lunar South Pole resource exploration and launch Chang'e 8 in around 2028 to construct the International Lunar Research Station's basic model along with Chang'e 7. Wu also said China plans to launch the Tianwen-2 probe around 2025. He said China's international cooperation will include the International Lunar Research Station, the China Gulf Arab Lunar and Deep Space Exploration Center, and the International Deep Space Exploration Federation. Wu Weiren, chief designer for China's lunar exploration program, gave the clearest outline yet for the International Lunar Research Station. He said the International Lunar Research Station would be jointly built by China and multiple countries. It will be a comprehensive scientific experimental facility that will operate autonomously for a long time on the moon's surface in orbit, with short-term human participation. It will be expandable, maintainable, with 5 basic infrastructure facilities.
Wu also said the full model for the International Lunar Research Station would complete by 2040. After that, the station would further upgrade to a practical and multifunctional lunar base.
China National Space Administration and the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization also signed a joint statement on cooperation in the International Lunar Research Station Tuesday. 3月 CGTN 合肥 in Anhui Province.
Jinxi County of eastern China is home to more than 100 ancient villages which are still preserved today.
Our reporter Dai Kai explores how their cultural heritage is being protected.
When it comes to candy making in Zhuqiao village, Zheng Yunnan's name stands out above the rest. He's a master candy maker who followed in his father's footsteps.
I have been doing this for over 30 years. I learned this craft from my father when I was 20 years old. Now I am over 50.
The lotus root cell candy he makes is a mixture of glutinous rice, maltose, yellow beans, and sesame seeds. As an iconic snack of the village, the sweet treat usually sells out every day. It takes delicate skill to produce it, as the sugar streams are supposed to look as thin as the silk of a lotus. Is a craft that stood the test of the time. Much like his ancestral handicraft, the architecture here in this village largely remains the same.
These houses have been well preserved without any destruction. They're still all good. The newly built houses are located nearby, but this area is well preserved.
Walking around here feels like we're traveling back in time. I've been told that this village has thousands of years of history, with every nook and cranny well preserved, giving us a glimpse of a bygone era.
The creases on this path are the traces of the history left by unicycles, accumulated day by day. If we go by the age of these creases, they should be more than 600 years old.
Every crease and cobblestone in these ancient paths tell a story, and local official Wu Suzhen knows them all. She says the government here is doing all it can to encourage preservation of this treasure trove of history.
In recent years, during the process of preserving ancient villages in Jinxi, we have developed our own model. For example, we have separated ownership and management rights of the ancient village. When the operator carries out the renovation of the entire village, they can use the management rights to obtain a loan from the bank, thus achieving a conversion from assets to funds.
Jinxi County is not just preserving the past, but also embracing the future by exploring innovative ways to revitalize these ancient villages. Through its Save Old Houses initiative and concentrated protection plan, local leaders are creating a sustainable and thriving community that honors its roots. Dai Kai, CGTN, Zhuqiao Village, Jiangxi Province.
A dazzling multimedia spectacle has illuminated Jordan's ancient city of Petra. The Light Festival features eye-catching displays with audio experience in the famous Sikh entrance and 3D digital art beamed onto the World Heritage Site. The festival will last until the beginning of May. It's amazing.
And our headlines again. A 3-day truce in the deadly fighting in Sudan, which appears to be holding, is allowing foreign countries to get more citizens out.
US President Joe Biden formally announces he will run for re-election in 2024.
And the shares in US regional bank First Republic plunged nearly a third after a worse-than-expected drop in deposits.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
Or on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN Africa Live, and see you again tomorrow, same time, same place, from all the team in London. That's goodbye.
Goodbye.